Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I saw a fascinating piece in the National Post this past week. Canada has devolved into a childish country incapable of solving big problems, by Brian Lee Crowley, who is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And we welcome him to our show tonight. Mr. Crowley, thank you for joining us. How are you tonight, sir?
Brian, I'm very well, and I always appreciate the invitation to join you on your show.
Well, that's very kind of you. So you're talking about a New World Disorder series that you're contributing to, and you say after 70 years of relative peace and prosperity, post-war institutional structures are breaking down, globalization is in retreat, and demographic changes are reordering economies and power hierarchies. And what? Canada is being a child and can't respond appropriately?
Well, so look, so the Post has taken this idea of a new world order, and they've sort of turned it around. They said what's emerging is not a new world order, but a new world disorder. In other words, there's all kinds of things that are happening that are undermining the institutions that have created order and prosperity for us in the West over the last 70 years or so, since the end of the Second World War. And they're asking a bunch of thoughtful people to write pieces about what they want to say about why this established order seems to be breaking down. And so my piece kicked off the series. And what I wanted to say was that, it seemed to me that the institutions that have underpinned this order, things like free trade, the GATT followed by the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, which we created in the post-war period, NATO, which we created in the post-war period. All of these things require us to renew and reinforce these institutions because, the world isn't a stable place. There are dynamic changes going on all the time. The rise of China, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the realization that we face climate change, etc. All of these things have to be accommodated in this institutional structure that we've created. And what I was arguing in the article was, if it's true, we could have an interesting conversation, but I happen to think it is true. If it is true that we're seeing the breakdown of that order, I think it's to an important extent because the people who make decisions in our society are not being adult about these changes. They want to take their fantasies, their magical thinking, and say, well, we wish the world was, we wish the world was such that China was a friendly regime in which we could engage in trade without any danger to the security of Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, that's not the China that we know. We know that it's not the China that exists. We know that the China that exists steals our technology, doesn't play by the rules, kidnaps our citizens to blackmail the government into abandoning the rule of law. There are a whole series of things I could say about China. So if you behave as if China is the way you wish it was, as opposed to behaving in the face of what the reality of China is, you will make the wrong decisions because you will be making decisions based on a fantasy, based on magical thinking. And so in my piece, I took a bunch of examples. I think there are many institutions which we have created or given special care and status to: the universities, the institution of family and marriage. We talked about China. We could talk about Russia. We could talk about climate change. And in field after field, I feel that there's a good case to be made that governments in Canada are engaging in this kind of childlike, magical thinking about the way the world is. And I was trying to say, if we want to succeed in this new world, if we don't want to be sucked into disorder, but we want to see order continue because of all the benefits that it creates for us, the prosperity and the safety and all the other things that we enjoy from this order, we must face the world as it is, not as we wish it was.
Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Brian Lee Crowley in just a minute. And we're going to talk about some of the things he talks about. He talks about the breakdown of marriage. He talks about what St. Paul says to us. He talks about universities. It's a fascinating discussion of has Canada devolved into a childish country, incapable of solving big problems? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's recently written a piece in the National Post called "Canada Has Devolved into a Childish Country Incapable of Solving Big Problems." And sir, you argue that governments are living in sort of a childlike fantasy world where they're seeing the world the way they want to see it rather than the way it is.
Yes.
And you've used a couple of interesting examples. One of them in your piece is about St. Paul and his key insight in his biblical epistle to the Corinthians. He famously wrote, "When I was just a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." And you're then referencing that St. Paul has a message to our leaders today?
Well, yes. I mean, St. Paul is essentially saying to us that, there is a stage in our lives when we're children, and this has been confirmed by child psychologists and so on. When children are young, they engage quite naturally in, this kind of magical thinking that we're talking about, that they believe that, the world is subject to their whims, that it has to respond to their wishes. And what St. Paul is saying in that epistle is, when you grow up, you have to put away childish things. You have to give up the fantasy that the world must submit to your will, that it must act in the way you wish it would act, and you have to accept responsibility for the fact that you live in a world in which you can't live out your fantasies. You have to take the world as it really is, and if you want to succeed. You have to adopt the behaviors that confer success in the real world, and I think we're in danger of losing sight of that insight.
You talk in your piece also about family and marriage, and that really we've come to a state where we're moderating the dangers of sexual competition, civilizing children, caring for the aged and passing on both culture and property across the generations could be allowed to reach such a degraded state that we celebrate people breaking up their marriages because they feel unfulfilled.
Yes, I mean, back to this idea, Brian, that what has conferred such success on us in the West, and particularly in Canada, has been a certain set of institutions and behaviors that have conferred on us prosperity, safety, order, freedom. And what I was trying to point out was that, these institutions put constraints on us. If you're part of a family and you want that family to succeed, you can't just do whatever you feel like. Sometimes you have to think about the other members of the family. As my wife's always saying to me, it's not just about you, right? So what I was saying was that we as a society are constantly running the risk that we forget that these institutions that we value so much, like family, like marriage, like universities, and all the other things that we've been talking about, they require us to maintain them, to care about them, to think about the needs and the interests of others, and not just indulge in our own fantasies about what would be good for us.
So what are you saying? Is you saying the government is doing things today that are allowing the breakdown in marriage that they shouldn't be? Are you suggesting we should, outlaw divorce or something?
Oh, well, no. Look, it's not just about government. It's
about people too.
It's about people too. This is about Canadians. I mean,
but the rallying cry this past year has all been about freedom.
I know. And freedom is one of the things that I think we enjoy as Western societies. But, freedom comes with responsibility. and you know, back to this idea that we have benefited from all these institutions, but we seem to be entering a stage in the evolution of our society where we're not willing to pay the price of those institutions, which is sometimes you don't just get to do what you feel like.
Okay. So one of the other things that you talk about is climate change. And, this is something that I actually spoke to one of your other members of the Macdonald-Laurier organization about, where it's almost as if we have this attitude on climate change that all we care about in Canada is climate change that occurs here, that we're associated with, rather than the global impact of climate change. And the example being that our natural gas or our LNG would be far better than using coal in Europe. And so by not allowing regulatory approval of natural gas pipelines across Canada and LNG facilities on the east coast of Canada, we by definition are making the climate worse, because we're by necessity, Germany is going to be producing electricity via coal in Germany because of what's going on. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's certainly one of the things that I'm talking about. Climate change is a very complex issue. Believe me, I'm not in any way disputing climate change. What I'm saying is, because climate change is such a complex issue, we can't simply, for example, as I think the government of Canada wants to do, simply saying our response to climate change is to shift energy use completely onto the electricity grid. We're going to get rid of fossil fuels. We're going to reduce energy use, and so, and all of these things sound good. But in a complex world in which the standard of living of the vast majority of people depends on the availability of fossil fuels, of gasoline, of natural gas, etc. Simply saying, well, we're going to use less energy, we're going to use less fuel, has a series of knock-on consequences which we haven't thought through. For example, if we, to your point, if we don't supply Germany with our natural gas, either they're going to burn coal, which is far worse than the environment, or they're going to become dependent on Russia for their natural gas, which is the situation they find themselves in now, and they become subject to energy blackmail. I mean, it's quite clear that Russia has been damaging its own pipelines, carrying natural gas into Germany as a way to bring pressure on Germany not to support Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion. And so, these complicated issues can't be resolved by simply, let's flip a switch, let's decide we're going to use less energy. The world is a complicated place where these things are all interconnected, and we must be mature and thoughtful in how we approach climate change, just as we must be in respect to all these other issues that we're talking about.
What is your issue about universities? That we don't accept intellectual thought anymore?
Well, I was just using it as an example of an institution which plays a key role in our society. The role of universities, in my view, is they're kind of the maintenance squad for the entire body of human knowledge. We rely on universities to be the place where everything that is known by humanity is kept, is cared for, is built on, and extended. Universities are a training ground for the minds of the people of our society. And it used to be that universities were a place where our minds were sharpened and toughened by exposure to difficult ideas, often unpleasant ideas, ideas that challenged our comfortable assumptions, but we learned from them, and we advanced as civilizations through the conflict of ideas, often that we first come in contact with at universities. Whereas I think universities are increasingly becoming a place where the very idea of confronting people with ideas that make them uncomfortable is something that's no longer acceptable. That they say it makes me feel unsafe. Universities should be safe spaces where I only hear things I already agree with. But that's not the function of university.
You've got this paragraph, and that's really kind of interesting. It's that you say, in recent years, childishness has been the dominant fashion in Canada. We obsess about marginal issues that make us feel good, while nasty regimes around the world laugh at our moral pretentiousness and undermine the institutions we have so painstakingly created.
Yes.
Do you really think that nasty regimes around the world laugh at us?
Oh, I do.
Think that we're pretentious?
Yes, I absolutely do. Think about the Chinese. You know, we in Canada are great believers in free trade, and we were there at the foundation of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the GATT, which sort of was the institution that protected the rules around trade, and then we later became founding members of the World Trade Organization. You know, we believe in free trade with the United States. We've negotiated various treaties with them, but all of that is based on the assumption that the people that we partner with to trade with are playing the game by the same rules we are. But the Chinese want us to open our economy to them, to become linked to them, to become dependent on trade with them, but they don't play by the same rules that we do. The Chinese use our openness to trade as a way to manipulate us and create dependence on them so that they can then press us to, for example, you will remember, they kidnapped two of our citizens in order to bring pressure on us to release the CFO of Huawei, who was in the middle of a court process in Canada. And the Chinese basically said, well, we don't believe in the rule of law. So as long as you don't release Meng Wanzhou, we're going to arbitrarily detain a couple of your citizens and bring pressure on you to behave the way we want you to behave. We know that China, through its trade relationships with a number of countries, has stolen vast amounts of intellectual property, which they've used to build up their own economy in competition with our own. We know that they dominate the world market for things like rare earths, which are key components of batteries and solar cells and various other parts of the transition to renewable green economy, and they're using that strategic power to advance their interests at our expense. And every time we say, well, gee, we don't think you're sort of playing by the rules, they say, oh no, you can't complain. You wanted free trade, you wanted openness, you wanted a relationship with us. Well, this is the way you have to take it. So I think that China uses things that we believe in: openness, free trade, reciprocity. And uses it as a way to exploit our openness to their advantage.
So what's the alternative? What's your recommendation? How should we be dealing with China?
Well, back to this idea that we have to think about China as it really is, not as we wish it was. And we have to engage with China. There's no escaping the fact that China is going to be one of the most important nations in the world. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept that they kidnap our citizens, that they steal our intellectual property, that they blackmail us with their control of certain critical minerals. In response to things like that, we have to reduce our dependence on China so that we drive defensively, as it were. We have to work with other liberal democracies in order to create alternative sources of these key minerals like lithium and copper and so on that are so key to the development of renewable energy sources and so on, so that we're not dependent on China, so that we manage our relationship with China in such a way that We can continue to trade with them as long as they want to play by the rules, but we don't put ourselves in a position of dangerous dependence on China, which they have clearly indicated they will exploit at the moment's notice.
We're chatting tonight with Brian Lee Crowley. He is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about an article he wrote that suggested that Canadian governments are being childish, and that, frankly, our whole culture is being childish today, and that we can't grow up and deal with the issues that are confronting our world. Interesting argument. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got another Brian with me tonight, Brian Lee Crowley, who is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's recently written an article in the National Post that talks about Canadian governments and Canadian populace being childish in our attitudes, where we deal with the world the way we hope it to be or dream it to be, rather than the way it actually is. And he's used examples in regards to the breakdown of some institutions like marriage and our attitudes toward universities, that we don't have an attitude toward China the way it is. We deal with it hoping, thinking, dreaming that it'll be a democratic, liberal, capitalist, open, free economy like we are. And you've got some other comments that are kind of interesting. Let me read another paragraph to you and ask for you to elaborate if I could. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization predicts that in spite of the potential negative consequences of climate change, we can expect crop yields to rise 10 to 30% above 2012 levels by 2050, thanks to technological progress. Crucially, rates of future yield growth depend far more on whether poor nations get access to tractors, irrigation, and fertilizer. But to combat climate change, our federal government intends to reduce the production of fertilizer and obstruct economic growth powered by Canadian energy resources. These things will guarantee less prosperity, ensuring, among other things, that there will be fewer of the tractors and less of the irrigation and fertilizer that poor nations need to feed our growing global population. So you're saying we're actually doing the wrong thing.
Yes, well, back to this idea that we have this childish preoccupation that, oh, well, okay, climate change is bad, and my analysis of climate change is we mustn't burn fossil fuels, and so we can just turn down the dial on fossil fuels and somehow magically replace that with electricity, when the world is vastly more complicated than that. And what the argument that I make in the article is that the very best way to deal with climate change is not by governments saying, reduce the production of fossil fuels, but rather to allow us to use the wealth that fossil fuels make possible to create the capacity for us to find solutions to climate change. This is how we've always solved problems like this in the past. And the example I use is the fact that, 50 years ago, people were, everybody was setting their hair on fire over the idea that we couldn't possibly grow enough food to feed the billions of people that we could foresee being on the surface of the earth. The fact of the matter is that we have brilliantly succeeded in increasing our farm yields precisely so that we can feed those billions of people. And we did so by unleashing economic growth because the wealth that's created through economic growth is the capacity to solve problems. This is why wealth is important. It's not because you want to make people rich so that they can have yachts or something. We want economic growth in a society because the growth that we create is the means to solve our problems. So, when we discovered that we thought we were going to have more people than we had food, we started to invest our wealth as societies in the technologies that would resolve that problem. And we created tractors, and we created fertilizer, and we created sophisticated irrigation systems to the point now where we can have drip irrigation systems that put water directly on plants rather than spraying it, over fields in a profligate way. We have become incredibly sophisticated because of our ability to spend the wealth that we've created solving our problems. And the point of the discussion with respect to the next 25 years and the further billions of people that will be on the surface of the planet is that governments, in trying to solve climate change, are turning down the screws on economic growth, lessening our ability to create that wealth that is the means to solve this problem, to create the innovation and the discoveries and the scientific insights that will allow us to beat the climate change problem. As I pointed out in the article, we're doing this to solve the climate change problem, even though climate change is not the big issue that is going to prevent us from feeding people in the future. The Food and Agriculture Organization says very clear that climate change is not the problem for feeding people in the future. The problem is getting the capacity to increase our yields to the people who need it in the developing world. That's practical things like tractors and fertilizer and irrigation. So reducing economic growth in our societies in order to solve the climate change problem, in my view, is self-defeating. It won't solve the climate change problem, but it will impoverish and starve major parts of our population.
Okay, but our governments aren't trying to dampen economic growth. What they're suggesting is regulation and carbon taxes to discourage people using carbon-based fuels and incentivize a switch to renewable energies. What are you suggesting? That we shouldn't have carbon taxes? We shouldn't have regulation against pollution?
No, but why is it then that Canada, according to the OECD, is going to have the lowest growth rate of any OECD country over the next 25 years? I would make the case it's because we are not using the energy resources. There's one of the reasons. We are not using the energy resources that we have in order to create the wealth that would allow us to solve the climate change problem intelligently, while at the same time ensuring that the world has the capacity to feed its growing population. These things. So
I come back. What are you recommending? Are you recommending we get rid of carbon taxes?
No. I'm a fan of carbon taxes, but I don't think that carbon taxes are the reason that we're facing such a low growth future. In fact, the oil and gas industry has no problem with carbon taxes. In fact, they say having a reliable sense of what the price of carbon is going to be is very helpful to them in determining where to invest their money. It's rather that we're using all kinds of regulatory ways, like our inability to get infrastructure built. This is a policy problem created by government. There's a reason why we call the new legislation governing the approval of pipelines the No New Pipelines Bill, because even though we have the capacity, we have the world's largest reserves of recoverable oil. We have one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas. We could use those resources to create the wealth that would allow us to create the technologies that will allow us to solve climate change. But instead, the government says, "Oh well, we're going to stick a tight emissions cap on the oil and gas sector, so that basically you can't build new capacity to produce new oil, and even if you could, you can't get it to market because you can't build pipelines." And if you want to tell me that that's not the result of policy choices by the government, I got news for you. It's got nothing to do with carbon tax.
So it's government regulation. It's got to do with red tape. It's got to do with an attitude that says that we're not going to approve things. And is that primarily because of Indigenous governance issues, or is that because of NIMBYism, or is that because of environmentalism, or what?
Well, gosh, I think it's due to a lot of things. I think if we took the Indigenous issue first, My institute does a lot of work with Indigenous communities, and they're telling us that they want responsible natural resource development. They want environmentally responsible development because, often they live in remote communities where, economic opportunities are not terrific, but they live right on the natural resource frontier. That's where the opportunities are for them. And those communities that have been able to connect with the natural resource development and earn a good return from their ownership of the land and their, the intelligent exercise of their rights and collaboration with project proponents. This has created the wealth that allows them to solve their problems. So we did some polling of First Nations, not of Canadians as a whole, but of First Nations people in Canada, and a clear majority of them said that they wanted access to natural resource opportunities. They see that's how they build prosperity for their communities. So I don't think that's the problem. It's certainly true that First Nations activists who are opposed to natural resource development get a lot of airtime. You see them on the front page of newspapers, but that doesn't mean that they represent the First Nations communities that they claim to speak on behalf of. I think we have a government in Ottawa that believes that we can take some of the most valuable natural assets that we have. We have one of the rarest things in the world. We have a $1 trillion asset in terms of the oil sands. We have a $1 trillion asset in the Montney natural gas field, which is just one natural gas field. We have all of these natural resource opportunities, but the government says, "Oh, we think that we can't exploit those for reasons of climate change," and so they start to turn down the regulatory screws on access to energy in Canada. My argument in the piece in the National Post is that this is a simplistic way of thinking about how to combat climate change, that we do it far better by creating more wealth rather than less, and using that wealth to feed our capacity to solve the problem of climate change. We don't solve climate change by impoverishing ourselves, by refusing to develop the resource assets that we have.
Now, some people have been worried that the appointment of an environment minister that was a environment activist is the cause of some of these problems. You think it's not that; it's more than that. It's this whole childish attitude within government in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Minister Guilbeault is a manifestation of the problem. He's not the problem. I think there are lots of people in the PMO, in the Prime Minister's office, and elsewhere in the government who believe that climate change requires us to leave our energy resources in the ground. The argument that I'm making is what we want to do is to solve climate change, not to leave resources in the ground. If leaving resources in the ground actually obstructs our ability to fix climate change, then I think it's a self-defeating policy, and that's what I'm calling them out on.
Fascinating. We're chatting with Brian Lee Crowley tonight, the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, about an article that he's written called "Canada Has Devolved into a Childish Country Incapable of Solving Big Problems." We're going to take a final break, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask Mr. Crowley if it's government that's the problem, or if it's our populist, our extremism, and best identified by what happened with the trucker convoy this past year. That's the problem. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Brian Lee Crowley. He is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's an organization that is a think tank, sponsors a lot of research into Canadian issues, and public policy issues. I've had the pleasure of interviewing several different members of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on different topics, from China to Ukraine to Russia to mining to climate change, etc. And it's been a real pleasure for me getting to know some of these incredibly intelligent ladies and gentlemen. Though Brian Crowley's piece in the National Post is pretty provocative. What it says is that we've devolved into a childish country incapable of solving big problems. And sir, most of your argument so far has been about government. But I'm going to challenge you for a second, if I could. I think that there was an interesting couple of tweets that I saw in the last couple of days comparing the protests in February in Ottawa to the protests in Iran. And they were saying, but we don't have bouncy castles in Iran, and there's no rock music, and there's no hot tubs. That the Iranians have found something to really protest against and are protesting in a non-childish way. This whole call for freedom. And, when I talked about this about a half hour ago earlier in the show, you said, yes, but freedom comes with responsibility. But isn't there a whole segment of our society that actually don't believe that freedom comes with responsibility? They don't think they had to wear a mask or get a vaccine to protect their health or anyone else's health. And they thought that they could take over, downtown Ottawa and dramatically impact everyone else's life. And this cry of freedom, in my mind, has seemed to take over one of our major political parties. Is government the problem, or are we the problem? That there's such a huge segment of our society that just want to stamp our feet and yell freedom at the top of our lungs and expect to get it without any responsibility.
Well, look, it's certainly true that governments don't act in a vacuum. Governments respond to what they think the population wants. And to the extent that we as Canadians have started to say, yeah, as I think we do, we don't know much about the world. We're not all that concerned about it. I talk to people in the political parties all the time. I talk to them about China. I talk to them about Russia. I talk to them about Ukraine, et cetera, and they say, yeah, the thing is, we have tried to talk to Canadians about these issues. They just don't take an interest in them. There are no votes in these things. So we only talk about things like, subsidized housing and dental care and so on. And I don't mean to denigrate those things. I know that these are things people wrestle with, but the fact of the matter is we live in a dangerous world in which many of the assumptions we make about, our prosperity is just a given, that, the safety that we enjoy as Canadians is just a given. I'm here to tell you that they're not givens, that we have to constantly renew the institutions that guarantee these things. And so, for example, when NATO says, well, gosh, we need every member of NATO to spend 2% of their economy on defense measures so that we can make sure that people who don't have our interests at heart, like the Russians or the Chinese, if they act provocatively or destructively, or they invade Ukraine, or they shut off energy supplies to the West, we are in a position to respond. And it's very hard to get Canadians to take any interest in these issues. These are big issues. These are big responsibilities. We love our freedom, but we aren't necessarily willing to make the sacrifices to defend them when they may be costly. And that's I think this is a this is a problem for Canadians. We think that everybody in the world likes us, that the world is divided into two groups. There's our friends and the friends we haven't made yet. There are people out there who do not wish Canada and our way of life well, and they're willing to invest significant resources, disinformation, using our trade openness against us, kidnapping our citizens, etc. And we don't seem to be willing to rise to the responsibility of pushing back and saying, actually, we value very deeply the things that we have created for ourselves, we sacrificed to create in the first place, and we are willing to sacrifice to see them continue. I worry that we think that somehow the world owes us these things, and the world owes us nothing. We have to create these things for ourselves.
The final sentence of Brian Lee Crowley's column is, "It's time for Canada to grow up, because while we may not be interested in disorder, disorder is interested in us." It's time for Canada to grow up. Sir, I really appreciate you speaking with us and reading your article. I agree with a lot of it. I think that government has been living in a sort of this is the world that we'd like to have rather than the world that is. I think we have that relative to China. I think we had that relative to Russia for a long period of time, and I worry that we still do have it relative to Russia, and don't believe that he could actually use nuclear weapons, that he won't invade another country. If history is any example, Hitler kept on invading countries and thought that he was going to be saved near the end by a rocket that was going to blast all the way to London, England. And thank God that the Allies, the United States, developed nuclear warheads prior to Nazi Germany developing that, because the world would be a very different place today if that technological race had been different. I do think that productivity and prosperity are a big issue, and that we haven't paid nearly enough attention to it. The former Minister of Finance, the former Liberal Minister of Finance, has effectively said that in the past couple of months. But I guess the one place where I disagree with you is, I think that while government has been childish, I also think we are. And I think we got to stand up and realize it. And I think the biggest thing is that what you said, freedom comes with responsibility, is not something that I think everyone agrees with. I think a lot of people don't think freedom comes with responsibility. I think that a lot of people in Canada today think that freedom is just what we have, and we have a right to it, and they don't either recognize the responsibility that they've been demanded of them in the past, and or think they can get away with providing that responsibility in the future. And so I think that's a process, and I worry that there are some politicians that want to take advantage of that dream that we can have complete freedom without any responsibility. And I hope that they grow up themselves. Anyway, great article. I really enjoyed it. Sir, anytime you want to chat with me on the radio, you let me know.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's always great to be on your show.
Well, that's my show for tonight. Thanks for joining me. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.